Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Mariancho, and these are my wide receiver rankings for Week 4. As always, this video is intended for half PPR leagues, and if you have any questions for full PPR, let me know in the comment section. But it is Week 4. There are some injuries to speak of. Most notably, CeeDee Lamb is out for 3 to 4 games, so might go on IR, hopefully not, but this matchup against the Packers, definitely don't expect him on the field. Mike Evans also suffered an hamstring injury, so he's out for this game. At least that's what I'm expecting. He's doubtful at the moment. Rashee Rice still suspended, but Jordan Addison and Demarcus Robinson's suspension was lifted, so they will suit up this week. Jaden Reed was placed on IR. Brandon Ayuk still on the PUP list, and then Jalen Coker, Jalen McMillan also on IR as well. So those are the unranked players, and before we get into the rankings, let's talk about some matchups this week. What are the upgrades and downgrades at the position? This chart will illustrate how the matchups shake out. The blue dots represent every single defense in the NFL, how many points per game they're allowing to the position through the first 3 games. And then in red, you see how many of those points are strictly attributed to yardage. So the yards per game allowed divided by 10 is that red dot below the blue dots. So in terms of upgrades, there's clearly one that's way better than the rest. The Cowboys are giving up 41 points per game to the position. That is clearly the top matchup you can ask for. Just ask Romeo Doubs and Caleb Williams last week. Luther Burden and DJ Moore also scored a touchdown. So Dallas faces the Packers this week, which is kind of unfortunate. Their receiving core is pretty random sometimes. However, Matthew Golden, Romeo Doubs, and Dontavian Wicks do deserve an upgrade this week. So I think this could be a breakout game for the rookie. I think he's the guy that offers the most value overall. But in general, it's just kind of hard to know exactly where the ball's going to go amongst the Packers receivers. So that's a little unfortunate, but still an upgrade worth mentioning. And then Chicago is the number 2 matchup. They allow a lot of touchdowns at the position, especially. Only about half of those points come from yardage alone. So I would upgrade Jakobi Meyers and potentially Tre Tucker as well. The Bears have had a lot of injuries in the secondary this season, and Jauan Jennings is not a concern. So Chicago, a very good matchup, just like last week. And the Giants are maintaining at the top of this chart. So the Giants defense has been atrocious this season. They get the Chargers this week, so upgrade Ladd McConkey, Keenan Allen, and Quentin Johnston. I think all 3 Chargers receivers have start consideration in this game. And then the Titans have been pretty brutal at stopping the pass as well. So maybe Adams and Puka Nacua factored in week 2. They really did torch him, but still it's a definite upgrade. 34 points per game. Nico Collins, definitely a lock in your lineup. I don't think you've seen enough from Stroud to trust another receiver there, however. In Las Vegas, they've been pretty bad in the secondary, so Romeo Doubs, DJ Moore, and Luther Burden get an upgrade yet again. I don't think I trust Burden yet, but Rome feels locked into the lineup. Feels like a top 10 play every week going forward. The Jaguars, also pretty bad at stopping the pass. They're much better against the run, so I do think Ricky Pearsall, Jauan Jennings, and maybe Demarcus Robinson, coming off suspension, have a bit extra value. I would trust Ricky Pearsall and Jauan if he starts. The Commanders have also been bad against the pass, better against the run, so Drake London, Darnell Mooney, hopefully bounce back. It's been a rough start to the year for London and Mooney as well. But the next upgrade, also giving up over 30 points per game, would be New England. The Patriots are pretty lackluster without their top corner. As long as Christian Gonzalez remains off the field, then I would upgrade Tetairoa McMillan, and maybe you'll have some consideration for Hunter Renfrow and Xavier Leggett. Maybe, but probably not. In Detroit, the Lions are also pretty bad in the secondary, so Jerry Jeudy and Cedric Tillman should bounce back after a terrible game against the Packers. And then the last matchup I want to mention, giving up over 29.5 points per game, would be the New York Jets. We thought that they might be a downgrade, especially Sauce Gardner kind of scares you on paper, but this year they have not been a viable defense to worry about. So Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle off some extra rest they played last Thursday might be good starts yet again against the New York Jets. But on the opposite side of this chart, there are some definite downgrades. And if you look at the last 4 teams on this graph here, none of them are giving up over 100 receiving yards per game to the position. The bottom 4 teams are all averaging about 97 receiving yards per game allowed to opposing receivers. So the Vikings have been a lockdown defense. Part of that was the Falcons just using Bijan Robinson in week 2, but last week they completely shut down the Bengals. The Vikings have a great defense. I would worry about DK Metcalf and Calvin Austin. The Dublin game in Ireland is probably not going to be a shootout, not from the Steelers' point of view. I would fade them. The Seahawks have also been an elite secondary this year. Not a surprise. They were great last season as well, and they rank as the second toughest matchup. So Marvin Harrison Jr., not a safe play. In general, I'm not a believer in him, and there's no one behind him, so I don't trust Kyler Murray or any pass catcher in Arizona other than McBride this week. And then Carolina has also been really good at stopping the pass themselves. Last year, they were terrible against the run and also really good in the secondary. This year, they're better against the run and still pretty elite against the pass. So Stephon Diggs and Kayshon Boutte, Demario Douglas, not safe bets. That receiving core is pretty random, and in general, other than Hunter Henry, I don't trust anyone in the first place. So big downgrade for Diggs. I wouldn't start him this week. And then the Packers have also had an elite defense as well. They give up maybe more receptions and touchdowns than these other bottom 3, but similar to them, also less than 100 yards receiving expected per game from their opponent wide receivers. So I would fade George Pickens, even though he does get an upgrade because of CeeDee Lamb starting, then downgrade him a little bit. Don't expect a top 10 performance against such an elite team like the Packers. But with no CeeDee Lamb, you have to start Pickens. I don't think I would start anyone else, though. Jalen Tolbert does not deserve an upgrade. San Francisco, also a downgrade, but maybe not in the same class as the 4 toughest matchups. 21 points per game is basically tied with Atlanta right there. So the Niners go against Brian Thomas Jr., Travis Hunter, and Parker Washington this week. Maybe De'Ami Brown also factors in. I don't know what to make of the Trevor Lawrence passing game. It is pretty terrible this season. I would not start a Jaguar with confidence this week. The Falcons get Deebo Samuel and Terry McLaurin. Terry dealing with a quad injury, might not play, so Deebo probably locked into some volume, but the Falcons without AJ Terrell are probably not as scary as this stat would suggest. They missed him last week, and they had no real answers for the Panthers' offense in general. So despite being a downgrade on paper, I don't think I'd benched Deebo Samuel, but Terry McLaurin with an injury, probably not a safe bet, especially if Mariota is the quarterback again. The last 2 are the only ones I will mention. After that point, it gets pretty flat, and these final 2 matchups, I think, are legit downgrades in general. The Chargers and Denver have given up less than 23 points per game to opposing receivers, but they are a bit higher on the yards per game allowed compared to the other defenses ranked behind them. They give up about 140, 145 yards per game to the position each week so far. So the Chargers are getting a rookie quarterback this week, so maybe Malik Nabers and Wan'Dale Robinson don't offer that much upside, even though the quarterback does offer more optimism. And then Denver, with some lockdown corners, is going up against Jake Browning, Jamar Chase, and T. Higgins. I would definitely downgrade Jamar against Pat Surtain. And then even though T. Higgins torched them in Week 17 last season, I do think Jahdae Barron, the first-round pick, is going to pose some problems as well. So neither Bengals receiver gives me much confidence. And those are the upgrades and downgrades in terms of matchups this week. And now let's get into the ranks overall at the position, where 1 and 2, I think, are locked in. If you have Puka, Nacua, or Amon-Ra St. Brown, congrats. The receiver position has been kind of brutal. A lot of the early round picks at wide receiver have let you down, but not Puka and not St. Brown. Puka is second most in targets among all receivers, most receptions in the NFL with 29. He also has the most yardage among any wide receiver. He's the safest play that you can find. With St. Brown, he's top 15 in targets with 25. He's also 6th in catches with 20, so he's a very reliable target for Goff. He's 7th most in yards at the position, and he also has the most touchdowns among all NFL wide receivers with 4 of them. I cannot think of a flaw for either player. So those two are really in a class of their own. I don't think there's any other player who has locked in such elite performances that they have to be considered above this purple line. The top 2 are in a class of their own. But tier 2 I think is pretty deep, and starting at number 3, I do think Romeo Doubs has entered must-start status and will be a top 10 play rest of season. He's top 8 in targets, top 10 in catches. He has the most touchdowns, tied with Amon-Ra with 4, and he clearly has the number 1 chemistry in Chicago with Caleb Williams. So it's the Ben Johnson offense. We've seen elite receiver production in the past as well. He cannot be benched. I think he's a clear top 5 play. Against Las Vegas, we mentioned it earlier, it is an upgrade. Their secondary has been bad. So love Rome, have to keep starting Odunze. And at number 4, you cannot bench Jaxon Smith-Njigba either. JSN is top 5 in targets, 3rd highest in catches at the position, and also has the 2nd most yards among all wide receivers. He's emerging as an elite NFL wide receiver, and it looks like top corner for the Cardinals, Will Johnson, the rookie, probably is not going to play. He didn't play last week. The game is on Thursday night. So everything is looking great for JSN right now. A clear wide receiver 1, top 5 play in week 4. At number 5, there's no chance you're benching Davante Adams. He looks matchup proof. And as long as Matthew Stafford stays healthy, he's going to be a top 10 receiver every week. And this Colts matchup looks like it could be a shootout. I would expect Adams to score another touchdown like he has each of the last 2 games. Gotta trust Adams. He looks like a bust-proof option every week. At number 6, we got Garrett Wilson at Miami, who is also top 4 in targets with 30 on the season. He has the 4th most catches in the NFL with 21 and 9th most yards among all wide receivers. With 2 touchdowns this season, the only red flag we had for him coming into the year has not been a problem. Touchdowns are hitting at a pretty reliable rate. So against the terrible Dolphins defense, they're going to have no answers here. You know Garrett Wilson will be elite in target share, and I really don't think the Dolphins will have any answer all season. Their defense is going to be trash. So I believe Garrett Wilson will continue to remain on fire, and if you do look at his last 5 career games versus the Dolphins, well, he hasn't been very good, only 10.7 points per game. They no longer have Jalen Ramsey, so volume hasn't been holding him back against the Dolphins. 8 targets per game on average, 6 catches, 65 yards, but only 1 touchdown in 5 games. I think the touchdown will be there, and I also think he probably gets closer to 100 yards in this matchup. So definitely, I would start Garrett Wilson this week. I think he's a top 10 play yet again. At number 7, we got Malik Nabers versus the Chargers, and if it wasn't for this matchup, I would probably rank him at number 3, but I don't think he's matchup proof. Last week against the Chiefs did prove that, and although they're upgrading the quarterback, I think Jackson Dart will help the fantasy production for Nabers. He did not practice on Wednesday, dealing with a back injury, so I don't think the preseason back injury is something to dismiss. Odds are Nabers will suit up, and if he does, you have to start him. So I do rank him top 10, but there is a chance that the back injury does linger and does limit him, and then there's also a chance that the Chargers are just so good on defense that Jackson Dart looks like shit in his rookie debut. So that's the main reason to downgrade him. Until we see Dart in action, I don't think Nabers is bust-proof against an elite matchup like the Chargers defense. So you could put him at number 3 in the ranks, and I wouldn't argue with it too much. He is 3rd in targets and also top 10 in receptions. He ranks 4th in yards at the position, also one of the few players with 2 touchdowns. So he's also one of the better investments in round 1 so far, but against the Chargers, I do downgrade him towards the bottom of the top 10. At number 8, we got Nico Collins versus Tennessee, and Nico is starting to step up. Last 2 games of the touchdown have been good, but if you remove them from the equation, he's not been special. So he is a bit touchdown dependent, and overall, I would like to see the volume maintain at this elite level. On the season, he only ranks 15th in total targets, but last 2 weeks he's averaging 10 targets per game. That's what we expected entering the season, and he's really the only thing that's working in the Texans offense. So despite their terrible offensive line, I still trust Stroud to target him often, and I do think Nico is still a must-start top 10 play moving forward. If we look at his last 3 games versus the Titans, he is averaging 13.9 points per game with Stroud as the quarterback. So 7.3 targets, 5.7 catches, 70 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns in those 3 games. Pretty high odds he goes over 12 fantasy points. So I would trust the volume to stay high. I don't think it'll diminish like in week 1. I don't fear the Titans in the secondary. So an upgrade overall, top 10 play for sure with Nico Collins. At number 9, I will put A.J. Brown back in the top 10. Based on where you drafted him, you have to keep starting him. So last week was encouraging. They decided to throw him the ball, and surprise, surprise, good things happen when you do throw the ball to A.J. Brown. So I don't fear the Tampa Bay Bucks matchup too much, but they have played well this season. They have limited some of their opponents. However, I think this game is much more likely a shootout than a very low scoring game. So last week, the Rams forced their hand. They scored enough points where the Eagles had to throw it, and I think Baker will do the same. Even without Mike Evans, I still think that the Bucks will score points. So plenty of upside. I expect the volume to be there, and last week was a good sign. I think they'll start to use him more often. They at least should. I don't see why they wouldn't. So A.J. Brown back in the top 10. Last week quelled some of your red flags, but there are still some lingering. It's possible they can win without him. We've seen it happen before, but this week against Tampa, I don't think that'll happen. I think they need him in order to compete. At number 10, we're still going to trust Justin Jefferson, but don't feel great about it. Versus Pittsburgh in Dublin, Ireland, there is some variables here with the Jordan Addison suspension being lifted. Addison will be back on the field, so on one hand, that takes away some defensive attention and does improve the value for Jefferson this week. But then on the other hand, Addison also eats into the target share, and some of those deep targets may not click for Jettas. So there's generally kind of just a non-factor with Addison coming in. Whatever benefit Jefferson gets, it's also taken away. And I still don't fully trust Carson Wentz. So against the Steelers' old veteran defense, I think the Vikings offense will play well, but they also might just lean on the run like they did last week, where Jordan Mason has 2 touchdowns. TJ Hawkinson also had pretty good chemistry with Carson Wentz. So I don't trust Wentz enough to keep Jefferson in the top 5, but based on draft capital, based on his personal talent level, you can't bench him. He's still in the top 10 for me personally, but a little bit worried about it. Similar to A.J. Brown, there are some red flags going off and some capped diminished upside, but in general, I would trust Jefferson to be a fine start in fantasy. It'd be hard to convince me you should bench him against the Steelers. They've dealt with some injuries in the secondary, not looked very good overall. Last week's win was kind of gifted to them by the Patriots fumbling so much. So Jefferson, I think, will be fine. I'm not worried about Jefferson. I think you have to start him if you have him. Another player who's earned must-start status would be Keenan Allen of the LA Chargers. He goes up against the Giants this week, and Keenan, shockingly, at 33 years old, is the number 1 receiver in LA. He's 7th in the NFL amongst receivers in targets with 29 on the season. He's also 7th in catches with 19. He's tied for the 4th most touchdowns among all NFL receivers with 3, and only 3 players have more than him: Romeo Doubs, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Tre Tucker. So Keenan is locked into the lineup even at 33 years old. At some point, I do expect him to get banged up, but for now, he's healthy. For now, he is locked into your lineup as the top target for Justin Herbert. So the Giants can't stop anyone. I mentioned it earlier in the video. It is a big upgrade in terms of teams to go against. However, this is a weird spot where the Chargers have to travel to the East Coast and play at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. If there's one player that maybe is slow, it could be the veteran Keenan Allen. So maybe they'll favor the rookie Omarion Hampton. Maybe they'll favor the younger receivers QJ and Ladd, but that feels like nitpicking. I can't think of any other reason to be worried about Keenan Allen. So not going to fade him. A lock in your lineup. He's earned your trust. A must start playing with Justin Herbert. At number 12, we got Courtland Sutton versus the Bengals, and he does have 2 touchdowns on the season. Last 2 seasons, that's been his main value. The touchdowns have been really safe to bet on for Sutton. And with Ingram going down, there's really no threat for that to change. So even against the Bengals, while it's a great matchup for the running backs, I think it's also a big upgrade for Courtland Sutton. The Bengals defense is terrible, so I expect Sutton to have a good game. Cornerback Cam Taylor-Britt did not play last week and is questionable for Monday night. I doubt he suits up, but maybe he's back on the field. Even if he is, I still think Sutton's going to be phenomenal. Not a big downgrade, even with Cam Taylor-Britt active on Monday night. So in prime time, I expect Sean Payton's Broncos offense to look way, way better. And I think Sutton is a lock in your lineup. He's at least a lock in the top 20 every week. And with this matchup, it's a clear upgrade. He moves up 8 spots to number 12, but he'll be ranked closer to 20. This matchup is definitely one to be more excited about with Courtland Sutton. At number 13, I got Emeka Egbuka of the Bucks versus the Eagles. And with Evans going down, the role for Egbuka is not going to change. There is the expectation that Chris Godwin will return to the offense this week, but Godwin is coming off a brutal ankle injury. And even though he does factor in, I still trust Egbuka to get the most targets. I don't think his role changes at all. So he's tied for 4th most touchdowns among NFL receivers, similar to Keenan Allen. He also has 3 on the season. And Baker's going to be throwing a shit ton of touchdowns. It feels like it's money in the bank to bet on it. And with Evans unavailable, I think Egbuka is a lock in your lineup. It's hard to fade him, even against Quinyon Mitchell and the very good Eagles secondary. I still think Egbuka has to be started. I can't downgrade him much. At 13, he's a lock in the lineup. At 14, we got Deebo Samuel at the Falcons, who is tied for 10th in terms of catches at the position. He also has 2 touchdowns on the year. And although the offense was diminished in the passing game last week with Mariota under center, Terry is probably going to miss this game with a quad injury. So assuming all of that happens, I still think Deebo is locked into the lineup. I think his role is not going to change, and odds are they're going to have to be more competitive all throughout the game against the Falcons. Last week they torched the Raiders, and I don't expect it to be as much of a blowout. I think Deebo needs to be involved in the second half this time. So should be a competitive game, multiple scoring opportunities. I trust his role, especially if Terry's not going to play. Deebo is their top target for sure. So love Deebo this week, even though the Falcons on paper are a downgrade. I don't think we've seen enough from Deebo to bench him. At number 15, we have Drake London versus Washington, who is still not the safest bet. He's been pretty mediocre so far, but I'm going to bet on the volume. He still ranks top 10. He's tied for 8th among all receivers in targets. He's at 27 this season, but week 1 he had 15 targets, which means the last 2 games it has been much lower overall. But he did deal with a shoulder injury coming out of week 1, and although he's played through it, I do think that's factored in. As the weeks go by, I expect him to look a lot better. He does rank tied for 10th in overall catches. He has 16 on the season, and that's still something to bet on. The volume is still there for Drake London, and I don't think Penix is going to look as terrible like he did last week. So at home against Washington, I do expect him to bounce back. But last week he was out-targeted by Darnell Mooney. That's not a good sign at all. So the Commanders matchup has been an upgrade so far this year. I'm going to trust that Drake London does capitalize, but if he gets torched again, I would panic. I'm going to give him one more week with the benefit of the doubt, but as someone who rosters London in a full PPR league, I am pretty pissed with what I've gotten so far. He's not very good, and if he can't find the end zone, I don't think he's a top 20 receiver moving forward. It's just not good enough so far. So this is the last week. I'm going to rank him above the blue line. Unless he breaks out in week 4, I can't envision he moves up the rankings at all. If anything, he might plummet by about 10 spots overall. So going to trust him one more time, but don't feel great about it. I think you have to because you drafted him in the second round. Moving forward, I think you're still starting these players. These are my lower end wide receiver 2s, but I would trust all of these players in my lineup, especially in the top 20 where Jakobi Meyers, I think, is a must start this week. The Bears are the second best matchup for opposing receivers. We just saw Tre Tucker put up 40 fantasy points against Washington. There is a lot of value in Las Vegas. It's kind of strange that it went to Tre Tucker last week instead of Brock Bowers and Jakobi Meyers, but very quickly that will pivot in favor of those 2 guys. So Jakobi has been a great option so far, a very high floor. He ranks 14th in targets at the position with 26 on the season. He ranks 9th in catches with 17, and he also ranks top 10 with yardage. He is very reliable from a floor standpoint, but he has yet to score a touchdown. I think at some point that will click, and if we get a game like we saw from Tre Tucker, just dispersed to another player. Wouldn't be shocked if he had elite upside. The Bears have a very bad secondary. So Jaylen Johnson expected to remain off the field. No downgrade whatsoever. Chicago is a matchup to chase. I love Meyers yet again. He's still been safe, even though last week was not as good as expected. I still really trust him from a floor standpoint. This week, I also think he will find the end zone. So love his upside. Jakobi Meyers, a must start, in my opinion. At 17, I think George Pickens is a must start as well. Bad matchup here against the Green Bay Packers. Definitely a downgrade. But with Lamb going down, I was tempted to put Pickens in the top 10. So he's moving down from an elite status already. So he can't be faded too much. Still top 20. Dak Prescott will put up decent numbers in primetime on Sunday night. He's not going to get sacked every play by Micah Parsons. So they're going to have to catch up. The game script will benefit Pickens. And other than Jake Ferguson, there's no real threat for targets in Dallas. So Pickens will be fine. Still a top 20 play. You have to start him every time. As long as Lamb is out, Pickens is a lock in the lineup. The upside's too high in Dallas. At 18, we got Ladd McConkey at the Giants, and you're probably pretty upset with what he's put up so far. One of those round 2 receivers that's let us down. However, against the Giants, it's a big upgrade. And Herbert and Harbaugh want to get him a touchdown. It's been 3 weeks without one, while Keenan and Quentin Johnston each have 3. Ladd is inevitably going to end up in the end zone. So odds are it happens this week. I still think he's better than Quentin Johnston. And I think he's also just gotten unlucky. I think the defense has favored stopping Ladd over Keenan Allen. And at this point, I think it's pretty obvious you can't ignore Keenan at all. So I think the defense will ease up on Ladd a little bit. And while I would rather start Keenan Allen this week, the touchdowns have been much safer to bet on. Ladd, I still think, is a top 20 play in this matchup. A very good upgrade against the Giants, and he's due for a blow-up game. At some point, it will pay off. So he's a good buy low candidate. There was an interesting trade in the subscriber league yesterday for him. Someone really needing running backs traded away Ladd McConkey for J.K. Dobbins and Rachaad White. I don't know if that was the right side of the trade. I think I'd rather have Ladd McConkey personally in that trade. Let me know in the comment section who you think won that trade in the subscriber league. Ladd McConkey or J.K. Dobbins and Rachaad White. Which side do you prefer? At number 19, we have Michael Pittman Jr. at the LA Rams, who's been really good. Tied for 10th in catches so far with 16. Daniel Jones looks like a potential MVP candidate. And although I think at some point it will fall back down to earth, the Rams have a really bad secondary. That is the clear weakness of their defense. And although they rushed the passer very well, they had no answer for a big receiver like A.J. Brown. So I do think Pittman, has very high upside. It could turn into a shootout in LA this week. It's not like he's going up against Pat Surtain in week 2. And in the other 2 games, he's been phenomenal for fantasy purposes. So I think he's a top 20 play. I think Pittman has earned your trust. A good start this week with Daniel Jones. At number 20, here's where I rank Xavier Worthy versus Baltimore, who is still questionable with that shoulder injury, not a lock to play, but I do assume he'll be back on the field. He's logged 5 limited practices in a row before being ruled out last week. So on Wednesday, as I'm recording this, I assume he's limited. I haven't seen it as of this recording, but odds are I think by Friday, he has a good shot to be upgraded to full by the end of the week. So even if he's limited again, this is a must win. They can't really fall to 1-3. Against the Ravens, they would love to have this tiebreaker for playoff positioning. So I do think Worthy will step up. I think he'll be back on the field. And although there's the risk of re-aggravating the injury, he's going to be the top target if active. So got to start him. The upside's too high. Until Rashee Rice comes back, the number 1 receiver in Kansas City needs to be in your lineup. So got to start Worthy. As long as he's active, he is top 20, but maybe not his best game of the season. He might not play every snap, given the shoulder injury is still a lingering factor. I don't expect him to be at his best coming off of the shoulder injury. At 21, though, I think Ricky Pearsall needs to be started as well. And assuming Jauan Jennings does play, that risk factors in. That's why I only rank him at 21. But if Jauan Jennings does not suit up, then we saw the value for Ricky last week. I might rank him in the top 12. I think you could argue he would be better than Egbuka, who goes up against Quinyon Mitchell and the Eagles. He'd be in the same category as Courtland Sutton, Keenan Allen, and Egbuka. So definitely start Ricky Pearsall, but if Jauan Jennings is active, the touchdown upside is limited. And we did see Jauan operate as the top receiver in week 2 when he was active against the Saints. So sometimes the Kyle Shanahan system just flip-flops in terms of who's the top target, and there is a potential that Demarcus Robinson factors in a little bit, but not enough to fade Ricky Pearsall. Definitely their number 1 receiver if healthy, and I would start him. He's looked pretty good so far this year. With Purdy, you feel a bit better about it, but even with Mac Jones, he's looked good enough to be serviceable and get the job done. So Pearsall, a top 25 option for sure. If Jauan can't suit up again, then he'd be top 15. I would definitely start him above a guy like Drake London. At number 22, we got DeVonta Smith at Tampa Bay, who should be involved. I expect more of a shootout against the Bucs, so at some point, Jalen Hurts is going to have to pass. DeVonta Smith is somebody who has too high of an upside when it hits to feel like he's a player you want to bench. If you bench him and he goes off, it feels kind of stupid. The upside is clearly 17 plus points when the touchdown is there. So I think it'll be a good spot this week. The Bucs have a good run defense, so I think Saquon might struggle. It'll be a competitive game. I picked the Bucs to win, and I think Jalen Hurts will have to throw. So I do like DeVonta Smith from a down the field perspective. I think he'll click on at least one deep pass, and odds are he finds the end zone. The reward, I think, is worth the risk with Davante. They threw it enough last week to feel safe with the number 2 receiver in Philadelphia. Too talented to bench. Same goes for Jameson Williams, too talented to bench. And against Cleveland, I would expect them to score a lot of points. And the Browns have a very good run defense, so I think JMO will be more involved this week. He looked great in the first quarter, and then he kind of disappeared. In the second half, he was a non-factor against Baltimore. And they scored a lot of points. A lot of it just came on the ground. And at some point, he will get back in the end zone. But volume has been the only problem for him. While he's looked outstanding at times, there have been moments of just him not factoring in to the overall game script. With a new offensive coordinator, maybe it will pivot from week to week. It looks like they're getting back to their identity of running the ball. So I mainly only trust Amon-Ra in the passing game, but because JMO can score from 60 yards out, pop a house call from anywhere, I think the reward is also worth the risk. Just like DeVonta Smith, I've ranked them back-to-back all summer, and I think he's still worth a top 25 ranking. JMO has too much upside to bench. So hard to convince me you should, but I understand there's a bit of bust potential here. I think against the Browns, though, I would trust him. I expect them at home to play very well. Jared Goff is a completely different quarterback when he plays in Detroit in the Dome. I think that deep pass for JMO will hit on a touchdown. At 24, I think I'd also start Zay Flowers at the Chiefs. The upside is just way too high when it works out, but damn, true image of a boom bust option. There is just no in between. You're either getting 100 yards and 10 plus targets, or if it's a bad game, you are getting jack fucking shit. Only 13 yards from him last week, and we've seen that yo-yo happen a lot for him. Dating back to last year, there was often times where one week he'd give you 110 yards, and then the next week less than 20, and it's a really risky proposition. But I think it's just worth the upside. That Chiefs game is probably going to look like a shootout. I know that the Chiefs have a great defense, and they have limited number 1 receivers a lot, but I still think betting on Lamar Jackson off the loss last week is a bet I wanted to make. And when Flowers clicks, it's just too valuable. So similar to DeVonta Smith and Jameson Williams, pretty much everyone in this tier following Michael Pittman, there's a chance to be completely burned and really regret it. But if you're wrong, if it's a good game to start them, the ceiling is so elite, you would feel kind of miserable if they're just sitting on the bench and drop 25, 30 points. So that's why I think you have to start him, but there's really only 2 stances to have on Flowers. Either you don't trust him at all and you're never starting him because you just can't afford to take the risk, or you don't give a shit and you will take the good with the bad. He is the new Mike Williams. You either get 20 points or 2, and you just start him regardless. I think if you drafted Zay Flowers, odds are you're in that second category, and you take the good with the bad, you start him just because when it's good, it is so high. He is a true week winner or week loser. Good luck. I think it'll work out. I think against the Chiefs, he plays well, but there is a chance, just like Nabers, he shits the bed for the second week in a row. Not that excited, but I think I have to. If I drafted Flowers, I think I would start him. At 25, the last player in this tier, I think, is in the lineup pretty much regardless, at worst as a flex play, is Tyreek Hill of the Dolphins. I'm not worried about the Sauce Gardner matchup, to be honest. He hasn't been a complete shutdown corner this year. And the main concern for Tyreek is really just Tua shitting the bed. But they get extra rest for this game. The season's basically on the line. If they fall to 0-4, it's over. They are cooked. And even though I think they lose and the season's already over, I do think Mike McDaniel is coaching for his job and will spotlight their number one playmaker. Tyreek Hill, I think, will have a fine game this week at home against the Jets. If we look at his last 5 career games versus New York, he's averaging 11.5 points per game, 8.2 targets, 6 catches, 61 yards, and 2 touchdowns. But although that's not great, it's fine. But if we look closer, there's really like boom bust potential here. In those 5 games, he has 2 games that are elite with 100+ yards and a touchdown. And then the other 3 games are terrible without a touchdown and less than 50 yards in those other 3 matchups. So it's really boom bust with Tyreek Hill as well. But I think the upside is so worth it. If he pops off, you're going to regret it. There is 25-point upside this week. The Jets game, I think, will turn into a shootout on both sides. So I like Tyreek Hill this week. I think he'll play well. I don't fear Sauce Gardner as much as I did last season. Next up, though, we are dropping down a tier, and now the risk factor's in, and there is some legitimate lack of upside with all these players. At 26, I'm finally ranking Ja'Marr Chase here as a high-end flex play. Odds are you're going to start him, but you can't pretend like you're not worried about it. Against Pat Surtain, it's the worst matchup you could ask for, and then Jake Browning is just not the guy. It's just not the same equation without Joe Burrow. So even though Ja'Marr Chase is tied for 8th in targets among receivers with 27, he has the 4th most receptions in the NFL with 21 among receivers. He's the 5th most yards among receivers as well. It means nothing to me. I am genuinely worried you get close to a bagel from Chase this week. Pat Surtain could blank him on the stat sheet. So I would be very worried, but at some point, he's too talented to completely fade. At 26, I think he's still in the start consideration. I think odds are you have to put him in the lineup. You drafted him 101. It's got to be disappointing, but I think you have to do it. I think he's got to be in the lineup just because you have him and you drafted him in the first round. You probably don't have elite depth where you can afford to put him on the bench. So not happy about it, really disappointing, but sadly at 26, I think Ja'Marr Chase is probably still in the lineup as a high-end flex play. At 27, we have Chris Olave at Buffalo, and interestingly, Olave has the most targets among any player in the NFL. 37 through the first 3 games. That is truly elite. Hard to ask for more from Olave, but you can legitimately be upset about it because even though he has the 2nd most receptions with 23, he's still only averaging 9.3 points per game. That fucking sucks from a player getting the most volume among any receiver in the NFL. So at some point it will turn into value, but so far it's been kind of worthless. Like, you got to be so fucking pissed with Olave because the potential is so high and what you're actually getting is so mediocre. In every single game this year, he's had less than 60 yards, even though last week he had 10 catches. What the fuck is that about? 10 for 57. That is atrocious. So the depth of target is the problem. Anytime Rattler targets him down the field, it just has no chance of clicking. In half PPR, it's a major bummer. If you have Olave in full PPR, then you don't give a shit. You're happy with him. He's a top 20 option, a must start every single week. But in half PPR, without the touchdown upside and no real value down the field, he's barely in the top 30. And the main reason I have him at 27 is because I think the Bills matchup offers some upside. You know there's going to be garbage time. You know they're going to be trailing. They have to throw like crazy. So I think he will crack the end zone. I think that ceiling is open. But in general, Olave does not feel like a safe top 30 bet at the position any week. It's just not really there in terms of upside. So the volume keeps the floor high. He is bust proof. I will give him that. But I just don't think he's a safe bet for a touchdown. And If it wasn't against Buffalo, I'd probably rank him around 35. I don't think he's a safe play at all. But this week, I do think he finds pay dirt. He'll probably put up about 4 touchdowns on the season, and that means every 4 weeks, you can expect about 1. He hasn't scored the first 3 games, so that means at a 25% projection, odds are he finds the end zone this week. I think it will happen, but if it doesn't, I wouldn't be that surprised. I don't feel like he's a high upside play at all. Just like Ja'Marr Chase in a terrible matchup. I'm not convinced he goes over 10 points. I don't think it's a lock to bet on, despite elite volume. At 28, we have Jauan Jennings versus Jacksonville, who is questionable, did not play last week with a shoulder injury, so might not suit up. But Shanahan said he's day-to-day. I would expect him on the field in this game. So as long as he's there, I think the floor is safe enough where you should be starting him. He was the number 1 receiver 2 weeks ago against the Saints. So maybe that was game plan specific, but I do think he can challenge Ricky Pearsall for the most targets in this offense. And I don't believe Demarcus Robinson is that big of a threat if he returns from the suspension. So Mac Jones can get the job done, but Purdy might be back on the field soon. I think Jauan Jennings is a safe play. The Jaguars don't scare you in the secondary. So I like Jauan as a top 30 option, a safe floor with good upside. I think odds are you're starting him as a flex play this week. At 29, I think odds are you're also starting Tetairoa McMillan. Tet, also similar to Chris Olave, has much more value in full PPR. But in that Panthers offense, I struggle to believe there's a lot of touchdowns this season, so not expecting more than 5 for Tet on the year. And maybe the percentages say that in the next 2 weeks, it will work out. He will find the end zone. But although he's tied for 8th in targets, he's not the most reliable fantasy play. He's mainly just a floor play, but the Patriots have been a generally good matchup so far. Without Christian Gonzalez, it is an upgrade on paper. So I do rank him a bit higher than I generally would. Last week was a weird game with a lot of game script going away for him. So even though he had good targets, he didn't have much fantasy production. I think he'll be better in a more competitive game on the road at New England. So I think he's fine, a good floor play with some upside. At some point he'll find pay dirt, but the volume should carry him to at least like 8-9 points. From a yardage and catch standpoint, I think he's a very safe play for roughly 10 points this week. And at 30, at some point, you can't pretend like Quentin Johnston isn't valuable. He's tied for the 4th most touchdowns among all NFL wide receivers, tied with Keenan Allen for 3 on the year. He's also 6th highest in yards among all wide receivers. He is legit. However, he is reliant on the deep play. If he does drop one of those targets, which inevitably it feels like he will, then he probably burns you with a bad game. But until it happens, he's been too good to bench. And the Giants have been a very good matchup, top 3 against the position so far, and that is a spot to upgrade every Chargers receiver. So we're in the flex territory. At wide receiver 30, there is risk with everyone, and I think the upside is just too high for QJ. He's been top 10 this season in fantasy points. So Herbert playing like an MVP. If the touchdown does not go to Ladd this week, it probably just stays in favor of QJ. And I'm tempted to rank him higher, but odds are at some point he does fall back down to earth. If he starts to drop passes again, you wouldn't be that shocked. But I think he is no longer a bust. I think odds are Jim Harbaugh has salvaged this draft pick. Quentin Johnston looks legit, very athletic. If he gets open in space, he can burn you for a house call. So love the upside for QJ. I think at wide receiver 30, a viable start as a flex play. At 31, I'd rather go Quentin Johnston than Brian Thomas Jr. this week. BTJ looks broken. This entire passing game for the Jaguars is terrible, and I think Shane Waldron is one of the main reasons of blame why everyone sucks in the passing game. So he's limited number 1 receivers in the past, whether it was JSN in Seattle his rookie year or last year Romeo Doubs in Chicago his rookie season. Waldron is not doing any favors to Brian Thomas Jr. this year. So maybe it's something else, but I think that's a major reason to be panicking on BTJ. And until we see some level of consistency, he's just not a safe play. Definitely just in the flex conversation this week. Similar to Ja'Marr Chase and Quentin Johnston, if they burn you, you're not going to be that shocked. So good luck. I think odds are a touchdown will work out sooner or later. But the Niners are a bottom 5 matchup against the position so far, and I'm definitely downgrading him extra because of that. So in general, you're still going to start him, but this week with the downgrade, he's just a flex play. If you have the space, then keep him on the bench. I don't think he's a must start. At this point, you got to be panicked. At 32, I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is a breakout game for Matthew Golden, the rookie receiver in Green Bay. I showed it to you at the beginning of the video. The Cowboys are the number one matchup overall against the position. They're allowing over 40 points every single week to opposing receivers. So Golden has elite upside this week. I think you want to be putting some Packers in your lineup. And although it's a very random target share, Jaden Reed is on IR, so is Christian Watson, and Tucker Kraft dealt with an injury late last week. He is not 100%. So the pass catchers will benefit, and Golden is one deep shot away from having an elite performance. I think the upside is legitimately 25 points for Golden this week. At some point, LaFleur will dial up one of those deep shots to the speedster, Matthew Golden. They want this first-round pick to look good. Going into the bye in prime time, I think it could work out. So while rookie receivers usually pop after the bye, I think this primetime game is a perfect spotlight for him. Last week, he caught all 4 of his targets, and for whatever reason, the Browns defense just shut down the Packers offense in general. So I do think against Dallas, they will put on a clinic, and I do think Golden could have his coming out party. I think his upside is way too high to dismiss in this matchup. It's just too good of a spot against Dallas, but he's not proven anything yet. There is a lot of risk involved. I'm tempted to put him above guys like Zay Flowers and Jameson Williams this week. I really think he could have a truly elite game, but at 32, we just haven't seen enough to fully trust. So I'd like to start him, but I get it. If you bench him, the Packers receiving core is a bit too random to know what you're going to get. But I do think if it works out, it's worth it. I think in DFS, I would like to get Golden into the lineup. The upside's way too high against the Cowboys. At 33, I got DJ Moore at Las Vegas, who did kind of just bail you out with a touchdown. I wouldn't expect that to happen all the time. And with Luther Burden stepping up a bit, that does eat into his target share. I think DJ Moore would have more value if he got traded. And I don't think that's a long shot to happen. He's the number 2 target starting to fade in Chicago, and they drafted Burden to replace him. So why not get something for him instead of just letting him go in free agency later? Maybe they hold on all season and trade him in the offseason. But I think there is a chance that by the trade deadline week 9, DJ Moore is on another team. I'd love to see him in Arizona, a team that is devoid of talent at the receiver spot. In Chicago, they get a good matchup against the Raiders this week. I think he's a decent flex option, but without the touchdown we saw last week, he could burn you for less than 20 yards. There is some major bust potential. If it's not Romeo Doubs, it's not the safest play in Chicago. At 34, the last player I think is a good start this week would be Jerry Jeudy, the last player I'm projecting for over 10 points. And I do think the Browns passing game bounces back on the road at Detroit. The Packers matchup was just so brutal. I was right to rank him outside the top 50 last week. However, against Detroit, I think he will bounce back. And I think odds are at some point he'll find the end zone pretty soon. I don't know if it's going to always go to Cedric Tillman. So maybe Tillman is actually the more valuable guy, but I do think Jeudy still has a pretty good target share established here, and I do think he is a safer start in general than Tillman, a bit less touchdown dependent, but so far, Jeudy has not been the better play. I could be ranking them in the wrong order in Cleveland, but I do think he'll bounce back. I think they'll look much better at Detroit. You know they're going to have to throw the ball in order to compete, so I think he's fine. A fine play at 34. You could start him if you had him, but odds are he probably only hovers around 10, 11 points. Maybe you have the depth where you can bench him. At 35, though, I think it's a viable strategy to start Chris Godwin this week, but because he's coming off the ankle injury, I'd rather see it. So he is the first player I'm ranking behind the black line. I'm not projecting 10 plus points, but if you told me he steps right in to where he left off last year, I wouldn't be that shocked. Without Mike Evans, you know that they need players to step up. So I think he'll be fine. I don't know if he'll be elite, but odds are they get him a touchdown, and Baker will probably keep him sustainable from a floor standpoint. I think Godwin's going to be okay, but probably not get 10 targets right out the gate. So at 35, I'd like to see it before I lock him into the lineup, but I do think there's a lot of upside if Godwin does play. That is what I'm expecting. He was limited all week in practice, and he wasn't placed on the PUP list. They did want him available for this Eagles game in week 4 by not putting him on the pup. At 36, I got Jaylen Waddle versus the Jets, and he does have 2 touchdowns last 2 games, but without it, damn, he's been a bit risky. That 3-yard touchdown last week really bailed you out. So I did tell you to bench him. It didn't wind up to be the right call, but if not for that red zone touchdown, he would have been really, really mediocre. He barely had 12 points with a touchdown. That sucks. So Jaylen Waddle still scares me. I think until they trade Tyreek Hill, he's not the safest play any given matchup, but this week against the Jets, I could see them play well. They have extra rest, extra time to prep. I think odds are Tua fights for his career, basically. Their season's on the line. I think a touchdown's not the worst bet to make. Waddle, though, at 36, probably not my favorite start. More of a low-end flex play this week. At 37, I'm probably going to fade and bench DK Metcalf. The Vikings have been the toughest matchup against opposing receivers this season. And if not for 2 touchdowns, Metcalf has been nothing special. He's not putting up many yards in this offense. So don't trust the veteran Steelers on the road in Ireland. I think the jet lag will factor in. And I think they could start so slow that Metcalf just has no value at all. Needs a touchdown to pay off. Similar to Waddle and Godwin. Without a touchdown, I don't think you crack 10 points or even come close to it. I would hit the lower on 50 receiving yards for Metcalf this week. I do not see it working out against the stout and elite Vikings defense. They are the toughest matchup you can ask for. The second toughest matchup would be the Seahawks, so I will fade and bench Marvin Harrison Jr. this week. He has not been good, only a maximum of 6 targets in 3 games this season, and the drop last week just confirms it. He's just not reliable. He's just not a good player, way overhyped, and hasn't lived up to expectation. I told you in the offseason, his dad did not improve at all in year 2. In year 1, Marvin Harrison Jr. had almost an identical stat line as his father. So odds are he's going to put up a very similar stat line like last season. Last year, he didn't rank top 40 at the position. So he looks like a bust, just not a top 5 overall pick. Given there's no other competition than Trey McBride, with Connor going down, he should be a safe play, but I don't trust him, not at all. So I will bench him. I just don't want to trust this player. He's never shown you that without a touchdown, he's a good start. And Kyler rarely throws touchdowns in the first place. No thanks with Harrison, but I get it based on where you drafted him. You probably still consider him at worst a low-end flex play. I still rank him top 40 because there's so few other targets in Arizona. At 39, I want to rank Darnell Mooney honestly like 7 spots higher, but I would like to see him actually put up good numbers in fantasy. Last week, he had 11 targets against the Panthers, but didn't do much with it, only caught 4 of them. And that shoulder injury is probably well behind him. I think the 11 targets puts that in the rear view mirror officially. So there's really high upside. I think there will be weeks, especially during the buys, when Mooney is a top 30 option, and he does have high-end upside down the field he could factor in at a high rate. But Penix looked like shit last week. The Commanders have been an upgrade in terms of matchups, but this could be a strange game. I think it's more likely a high-scoring game, though, so there is some high upside with Mooney. But until we see him actually put up more than 10 fantasy points, I'm not going to project him for that. So at 39, I'd probably still bench him. Unless I was desperate, I still think London is the only guy to start with real confidence in Atlanta other than Bijan. However, after his week 5 bye, I do think he'll be a very reliable staple as a weekly flex play. I think he does have value rest of season. At 40, we got Hollywood Brown versus Baltimore, so a revenge game for Marquise Brown, and he is still tied for 8th in targets, but obviously Worthy going down does factor in. Assuming Worthy steps back on the field, he's not as safe of an option, but in a revenge spot, I think he will find the end zone. I do think there is some legit upside, but without that touchdown, he probably burns you. So I'm not dying to bet on him, but the Ravens have had a terrible defense this season. I think Mahomes looks good in this matchup. It's a must win, and I think Hollywood will still be heavily involved. Worthy, I don't think, is 100%. Not going to run every route, not play every snap. So Hollywood still on the field, still going to get targeted. The revenge narrative, I think, keeps him interesting as a low-end flex play. At number 40, you could do worse than Hollywood Brown. I'd actually rather go Hollywood than T. Higgins this week. I just have no faith in Jake Browning. And with Jahdae Barron as the number 2 corner for the Broncos, I don't think the offense is going to get going for the Bengals at all. I'd be really worried. 2 years ago, when Burrow got hurt as well, T. Higgins was not a top 40 receiver. Last week, he was brutal. And until I see some consistency with Jake Browning, I just don't want to trust any Bengals receiver if I don't have to. In a bad matchup like this, I'm only going to start Jamar Chase. I don't feel great about that either. And T. Higgins is very touchdown dependent. I don't think it works out. I think that the Bengals could get shut out and put up less than 10 points against Denver. I have no desire to trust T. Higgins this week. On Monday night against the Broncos, a massive fade, in my opinion, not a safe start at all. At 42, sadly, Calvin Ridley is not a safe start either. I want to trust him. He's still getting the most targets in Tennessee, and eventually it will click with Cam Ward. But again, he gets a very bad matchup. He's pretty unlucky in terms of scheduling so far. Derek Stingley of the Texans is a major downgrade, so not going to start him if I don't have to. I think the upside is capped, and odds are Elik Ayamenor will find the end zone more likely than Ridley this week. So at some point, it'll work out, but this week I'm not going to bet on it. At 42, let's at least see one good game from Ridley until we start him. He's had a lot of drops, and that's not a problem that you can blame on the quarterback. It's his problem specifically. So figure things out, Ridley. I believe in you, but you have not proven why I should do that. You've been pretty bad so far this season. Not going to start him in week 4. At 43, I might be ranking Romeo Doubs 20 spots too low. There's a lead upside against Dallas this week. If I was betting on a Packers receiver, I'd rather go Matthew Golden. You could argue Romeo Doubs is far safer of a target, but he's pretty touchdown dependent as well. I think just like T. Higgins, if you don't get the touchdown, you will get screwed. It's really just the matchup why I'm ranking him this high. In general, I don't really rank Romeo Doubs higher than 50 at the position. So at 43, he does get an upgrade, but not enough to feel safe with him. Very touchdown dependent. It could work out. It's a great matchup, but I don't feel safe believing in it. At 44, we have Terry McLaurin at the Falcons, who is questionable with a quad injury and did not practice on Wednesday. So odds are he's not going to suit up. Even if he does, I would bench him. He's looked pretty bad this season, not even a top 50 receiver. And with Mariota under center, the passing game is just nowhere near as reliable. Terry's not a safe play. I only trust Deebo Samuel in Washington with Mariota at quarterback. So maybe Jaden Daniels plays and it's not a concern, but assuming Terry is active, I don't think he's a good play this week. The Falcons have also been a downgrade at the position. So not going to start him. Odds are he doesn't play at all, and the decision is made for you. But if he is active, I would bench him at 44. I'd rather go Romeo Doubs, and that's kind of all you need to know. Don't start Terry McLaurin in week 4. Rest of the way, though, I think everyone has way too much risk to start at all. You're really just praying for a touchdown. But this next tier of players does have that upside. Jordan Addison at 45 does make his season debut in Dublin, Ireland, coming off the suspension. He does have elite upside. We've seen it in the past. But with the travel, I don't know if Carson Wentz is going to be asked to carry the team, and that's chemistry that's just never really been established. Wentz barely joined the roster until late August. Addison has been not with the team the last few weeks. His suspension has kept him away from practicing with Wentz last week. So I want to see it before I trust it. TJ Hawkinson also had good chemistry last week with Wentz, so I don't know what Addison's role is going to be. And without a deep touchdown, he's just not going to be that valuable. So maybe it works out. Maybe he's elite in Dublin, but I just don't feel safe to bet on it. So I think I'm going to pass in week 4. I don't know exactly what to project from the Carson Wentz passing game. Odds are they rely on Jordan Mason yet again for multiple touchdowns. So no thanks with Addison. Let's wait and see. I doubt I start him next week as well. I think only until after the week 6 bye will you have any real desire to start Addison in your lineup. It's going to be a weird offense these next 2 weeks in Europe. 46, though, a player who has 2 touchdowns on the season is Cedric Tillman, and I could just straight up swap him with Jerry Jeudy and make a case for it. He has been better in fantasy, but I still slightly favor Jeudy, not by much, but Tillman is very reliant on those touchdowns hitting to have any value, so not going to bet on it. It's not that safe. And same goes with Elik Ayamenor. He's been better than Ridley, the number 1 receiver in Tennessee, and also has 2 touchdowns the last 2 games. So maybe you're more confident than I am, but without the touchdown, you will get burned. But perhaps I'm underestimating him. He is the number 2 target in his offense, and that is valuable. Against the Texans and Derek Stingley, usually the number 2 receiver, is asked to step up. So there is very high upside, but needs a touchdown. I'll probably fade him if I'm not desperate. I don't think Amon-Ra is a top 40 play against the Texans. At 48 and 49, we have both of the Bills receivers, and it's just too volatile. There's very high upside with both guys, but to guarantee it works out is pretty hard to trust. And Keon probably has more upside because he's more targeted down the field. But last week, Shakir did score a touchdown, but also failed to go over 10 points. Dalton Kincaid is the top target for Josh Allen. So last year, Shakir had a decent floor every week, but he had that Kincaid role. And this week, given it's pivoted off of him, I don't feel safe starting any Bills receiver. It's just too random to bet on. It could also be a massive James Cook game. All of the touchdowns could come on the ground. And even if the Bills score 40 points, neither of these receivers could give you more than 5 fantasy points. There is major bust potential with both of them. So I'm going to give it another week or so until I pin down who's the most valuable, safest start among the Bills receivers. But so far, it's just been so random. I don't trust either. I'm going to bench both of them. They're just not safe enough options, in my opinion. At 50, though, we have Stephon Diggs versus the Panthers, and it's a bad matchup. The Panthers have been really good at stopping the pass, bottom 3 against the position. And Diggs is also in a very crowded target share, very random in New England. If I don't have Hunter Henry, I don't feel safe starting a Pats pass catcher. So no thanks with Diggs. At 50, definitely going to bench him. And at 51, there is really high upside for Troy Franklin. I don't feel great about trusting him. It's just a weird vibe in Denver. And if you told me that J.K. Dobbins and R.J. Harvey just torched the terrible Bengals run defense, it wouldn't shock me if no player had any value other than Courtland Sutton this week. So he could pop off a very big game, big touchdown, but without it, you probably get screwed. I don't think he's earned your trust yet. Franklin deserves a roster spot, but not a safe start, even against a good matchup like Cincinnati. At 52, maybe you trust Tre Tucker after a big blow-up game, but odds are that never happens again. And he is the number 2 receiver in Las Vegas. That does have some value, but I'd like to see him have some more consistency. However, if you look at the last 2 games, he does have at least 8 targets in both of them, plus 2 rush attempts overall the last 2 games. So a very interesting high upside swing. I'm a full believer in Jakobi Meyers, and if Meyers ever lets me down, it's because someone like Tre Tucker did step up. That's exactly what happened last week. Maybe it happens again. Geno Smith does sling it like crazy. So this is a pass-first offense so far. Tucker does have value. The matchup is good. I might be underestimating Tucker by 30 spots. It's possible he's a top 25 option yet again. Next up, though, Tyquan Thornton versus Baltimore. I still think has some deep touchdown viability. He has 2 touchdowns on the year, and although Xavier Worthy probably comes back, I don't think Tyquan disappears, at least not until Rashee Rice returns. I still think he has some home run swing potential. It's a touchdown or nothing. Without it, you will get screwed. So odds are I won't start him. But if you told me he put up another 15 points this week because Mahomes throws him a 40-yard touchdown, wouldn't shock me. Definitely has that available in his bag. So Tyquan, an interesting pickup off the wire, but as the receivers get healthier, probably not going to start him. And then lastly, in this tier, we have Calvin Austin of the Steelers versus the Vikings. The Vikings are the worst matchup on paper. It's not an upgrade by any stretch. However, they will limit DK Metcalf quite well, and Austin also has 2 touchdowns just like Tyquan Thornton, Amon-Ra, and Cedric Tillman. It's not the worst bet to make. There is some upside thanks to the touchdown production for Austin. So good luck if you actually start him. Probably not going to do it myself, but at 54, there is a chance he gives you 15 points, just like Tyquan did last week. So good luck there. The rest of these players, I think, have no shot to be in your lineup this week, but I do think deserve a roster spot. Let's rip through the top 67 at the position. Wandale, we're going to wait and see for Jackson Dart, but it might benefit him. He might be higher upside like he was in week 2. At 55, Christian Kirk did get 8 targets in week 3, so there is some value there, but Stroud's offense has been terrible. Other than Nico, I won't start any other player in Houston yet. But Kirk deserves a roster spot. So does Luther Burden, I believe. I think at some point DJ Moore could get traded, and Burden will emerge more and more as the weeks go by. But he needs more than just a deep shot touchdown to have any floor. In fantasy, you can't start him yet, but worth a pickup if you need depth at the position. Rashad Bateman did pop off in week 3, but felt kind of game plan specific. I don't know if Flowers will be an afterthought every single time. So Bateman worth a roster spot, but not safe enough to start. High upside though, especially in DFS. He's kind of interesting. Dontavian Wicks also interesting in DFS. An elite matchup versus Dallas, but you don't know where the ball's going to go in Green Bay, so not safe enough. I'd rather go Doubs or Golden this week. And then Cooper Kupp at number 60 did fall back down to earth in week 2, but they won in a blowout. Perhaps his role does come back to him in week 3 against Arizona. But watch out for Torrey Horton. I have Torrey Horton right behind him at 61, and I would pick up Torrey Horton as well, because at some point Cooper Kupp probably gets hurt. He's been pretty banged up the last few seasons. So I do think Horton is starting to emerge. They like him a lot. And at some point, I think he'll be more valuable than Cooper Kupp. It might happen in the next 2 weeks. Torrey Horton, I think, is a good bench stash. I picked him up off the waiver wire in the subscriber league. I dropped Jaden Higgins to pick up Torrey Horton. At 62, this is the last week. I'm willing to be patient with Josh Downs. If he puts up another dud, I'd probably drop him. Maybe you have less patience than I do. He might already be on the waiver wire. At 62, no chance you can start him. At 63, I'm also giving Rashid Shaheed just one more week. He's the number 3 target in New Orleans, so very low upside for touchdowns there. And I think behind Jauan Jennings, he's just not a safe play. I feel more interested in other players, but Shaheed has scored a touchdown this season. There has been some level of value, but not much. Travis Hunter, also a drop candidate. What the fuck is even going on in Jacksonville? So maybe you'd rather have De'Ami Brown. He's been way better so far, even more productive than Brian Thomas Jr. And Parker Washington also factors in as well. So one more week of patience on Travis Hunter, but if he sucks again, then I probably am going to drop him. And then I will mention Sterling Shepard and Demarcus Robinson. They do have some injuries above them on the depth chart with Godwin and Jauan Jennings, who probably suit up this week, but it's not guaranteed. If those guys can't go, there's enough injuries on their teams where I do think these guys will get some targets. We've seen Sterling Shepard get targeted a decent amount the last few weeks. Last week he had 80 yards. Don't dismiss Shepard, especially if Godwin is inactive. So Shepard has some value, but not going to rank him very high this week until Godwin is ruled out. And then Demarcus Robinson, if Jauan Jennings is out, does have some starting value, but probably not enough since we've never seen it in San Francisco to trust. But maybe there's a touchdown for him. Maybe against the Jaguars, he does put up 10 plus points. So those are my receiver rankings this week. The top 67 at the position. The top 2, I think, are in a tier of their own. Puka and Amon-Ra are flawless players in fantasy so far. But tier 2, wide receivers 3 through 15, I think are all locks in your lineup. Very high upside and a safe enough floor in terms of volume. You have to trust them. You drafted them and you should be keeping them in the lineup. They've earned your trust so far, but maybe someone like Drake London, Justin Jefferson, and AJ Brown still have you a little bit worried they're not living up to the hype. 16 through 25, I think, are also in the lineup, safe plays that I do project for over 12 fantasy points. I think odds are the touchdowns work out, but even if they don't, based on yardage alone, I think they will keep the floor pretty high. I doubt any of those players in the top 25 are going to bust this week. But there is some risk with guys like Jameson Williams, Zay Flowers, Xavier Worthy, and Ricky Pearsall. There's always a chance they fall back down to earth. Even Lad McConkey could let you down in fantasy. Even George Pickens has a bad matchup against Green Bay. But I think you have to start the top 25. 26 through 34, I think, are going to hover around 10, 11 points this week. I have Jamar Chase, Olave, Jauan Jennings, Ted McMillan, Quentin Johnston, Brian Thomas Jr., Matthew Golden, DJ Moore, and Jerry Jeudy in the low-end flex territory. I think you're going to start him if you have them, but maybe you have the depth where you don't have to. They're not locks in the lineup, but definitely valuable enough to probably plug them in. They kind of need a touchdown, but I think odds are they will be fine for fantasy purposes. They probably give you at least 10 plus points. 35 through 44, I think, are also in the low-end flex discussion, but probably bad matchups or just too many red flags to actually start. Godwin coming off the ankle injury. Let's see it before we put him in the top 25. Waddle kind of touchdown dependent, but has paid off a little bit. Metcalf, terrible matchup. Same with Marvin Harrison. Mooney getting the volume, but not the production yet, so wait and see. Hollywood with a revenge game, still a factor, even with Worthy back. And then T. Higgins loses a lot of value with Browning against Denver. Ridley has yet to show up. Bad matchup for him. And then Doubs with an elite matchup, but low floor, kind of interesting. And then Terry could play well, but odds are isn't even going to be healthy enough to suit up. And then beyond that point, you just need a touchdown. Odds are it doesn't happen, but if it does, I'll probably have them ranked 20 spots too low. Addison coming off the suspension. Don't trust him yet with Wentz. Tillman needs a touchdown, so does Ayamanour. So do Coleman and Shakir, and it's a bit of a gamble to trust. Diggs has a terrible matchup, not a safe investment in New England. Troy Franklin, Tre Tucker have had good games on occasion this year, but the matchup is really the only reason why I'd have some consideration this week. Tyquan and Calvin Austin have also scored some touchdowns. They have some high upside if it happens again. But Wandale through Demarcus Robinson can be rostered, but definitely not started this week. Probably not that valuable in week 4. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. My name's Adam Riancho. I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.